Hello, History 1 students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have your notes for Chapter 15, Section 3, the Wilson Years. And we're going to talk about the election of 1912, which I would have to say is probably one of the most controversial elections, maybe in the 20th century, maybe up to the point of maybe the 1992 election, in the sense that when a political party splits, there's always going to be something different that's going to come along the lines. We had mentioned in section 2 that President Taft and Theodore Roosevelt had a kind of a parting of ways, and it had a lot to do with a situation with a guy named Gifford Pinchot, who happened to be the chief forester for the United States under Roosevelt to begin with, and then he was fired by President Taft for insubordination. And as a result of that, we're going to see this great split of the Republican Party. In 1912, we have an election year, and Taft and Roosevelt want to run for president. The fact that Roosevelt had sat out for 4 years, for the most part, he decides he's going to come back and he's going to run again with the hopes of maybe getting back into the White House and fixing all the things that maybe Taft, in his mind, had screwed up. And at the same time, we've got kind of maybe an unknown to some people, a guy named Woodrow Wilson, who happened to be a governor of New Jersey and also a former president of Princeton University. So if you take a look here, you're going to see that Roosevelt and Taft, had they not split the Republican Party, if you would add their totals together, they probably would have beaten Woodrow Wilson. They would have had far more popular votes as one political party. But unfortunately, when you split your party, you're going to have a big problem. Wilson had far more electoral votes, and that certainly gave him the advantage. If you also look here, Eugene V. Debs, who was our socialist candidate at the time, he is running for president, and he gets just shy of 1 million votes. And Eugene Debs, at this point in time, is sitting in jail for some of his work kind of with the labor unions and encouraging them to strike. So this was a very interesting election, needless to say. And number one, what did Roosevelt do in 1912 at the Republican National Convention when it became clear that President Taft's delegates controlled the nomination? Well, he left the political party and he decided he was going to form his own and become an independent. And the party that he forms is sometimes known as the Progressive Party, but it's probably oftentimes referred to as the Bull Moose Party. And if you remember the slide previously, they had a pretty cool moose for their political mascot, if you want to call it that. At the convention, certainly Taft's conservatives certainly were the ones who were in command here. And number two, what progressive actions did Woodrow Wilson take as governor of New Jersey? As I mentioned before, he happened to be the former president of Princeton University. Some people saw him kind of as what would be labeled as like an egghead. He was a professor type and kind of acted like that. But needless to say, he introduced direct primaries, something that we have talked about as far as being a progressive reform. He set up utility regulatory boards. He allowed cities to change to commission forms of government. So in a way, some of the things that we heard about Robert LaFollette in the state of Wisconsin, Wilson is adopting in his state of New Jersey. What reforms did Roosevelt outline in his 1912 election campaign? Some of the things that Roosevelt wanted to do was to protect women and children laborers. That might mean limiting the amount of hours that they could work. He was also trying to find a way to get workers' compensation. And this is money that's typically paid to workers who are injured when they're working on the job site. So these are kind of interesting reforms. Roosevelt called his reform program New Nationalism. At the same time, Woodrow Wilson, he introduced his reform program and he called it New Freedom. So I don't know if all these new programs were certainly going to confuse voters when they went to the polls by any means. If you take a look at the map, kind of in the bottom right-hand corner, any of those states that are kind of colored orange, those are the states that Wilson won. And if you look at Nebraska, we are one of the states that he was able to win. All right. Number 5, what did Wilson think of monopolies and Roosevelt's approach towards these monopolies? And Wilson, for the most part, thought that monopolies, for the most part, should be destroyed. Okay, it gave the federal government too much power over the economy, but didn't necessarily restore competition. This is kind of in opposition to maybe what Roosevelt was all about. Roosevelt, for the most part, thought that the federal government had the right to kind of monitor these, but at the same time, a lot of Republicans believe in laissez-faire economics to allow the, businesses to do what they naturally do to make money, and for the government to kind of stay out. And Wilson obviously must have thought that Roosevelt wasn't doing nearly enough to save the people from the power of monopolies. Moving on, what did Wilson think would lead American manufacturers to improve their products and lower their prices? And he believed that pressure from foreign competition would certainly be the incentive for them to kind of get things moving. Along with that, Wilson also proposed something known as the Underwood Tariff. And how did the Underwood Tariff affect imported goods? What it did is it reduced the average tariff on our imported goods. Some people say roughly 30% or half of what the tariff rate would have been in 1890. Another hidden part of this kind of goes into number 8. When we talk about this Underwood Tariff, aside from cutting tariffs on goods, we got to figure out a way to make money back. And so this important section in number 8 included a direct income tax on earnings. Eventually, this is all going to be transformed into what is known as the 16th Amendment, which is going to be added to our U.S. Constitution. And the amendment basically calls for a direct tax on income. And this was the first time that we had done this since the time of the Civil War as a way to raise revenue in the United States. Let's talk a little bit about banking reforms. In number 9, how did the new Federal Reserve System affect banks? And the Federal Reserve System, this was passed in 1913. Again, another one of Woodrow Wilson's programs. And what the Reserve was going to do is it was going to have banks keep a portion of their deposits in what we call a regional reserve bank. And if you look at the map below, there are a handful of regional reserve banks, roughly 12. And in our neighborhood, the reserve bank is in Kansas City. What's interesting is the state of Missouri actually is really unusual here because it actually holds 2 reserve banks. One kind of taking care of the Great Plains, if you want to call it that, in the mountain regions of the West, and the other basically kind of the south central part of the United States. And part of that had to be with the fact that there was a senator from the state of Missouri who was one of the big backers of this legislation through Congress. And so to reward him, they allowed the state of Missouri to have 2 Federal Reserve regional banks. So anyway, so these deposits are going to provide a financial cushion against any kind of runs on banks. And for the most part, it has worked. I mean, we still have the current system that was kind of set up under this Reserve Act of 1913. For the most part, it did allow people to have a little more confidence in the banking system. So how does the Federal Reserve Board affect the economy? You know, in these 12 regional banks, there is a board of governors that kind of dictates kind of what happens as far as the banking industry is concerned. And some of the things that they get to do is setting the interest rate. That's the rate to borrow money from a bank. So like if you put your money into, let's say, a savings account, you get a certain amount of money back from interest. And it's the Federal Reserve that kind of helps set that percentage. They also indirectly control interest rates and the amount of circulation of money in our economy here. And so every so often, the Federal Reserve, when they get money back into it, they will look at currency. They actually look for things like counterfeiting. And if they do find counterfeit bills, they destroy those, they shred them in this day and age. But they can also take money out that has been kind of weathered or damaged because of too much handling. So, for example, if you have like an old dollar bill that is all crinkly and maybe has gone through a washing or two, they can pull that from circulation and put brand new bills in. Okay, and the idea is if they're controlling that, it isn't necessarily going to hurt the money supply. It isn't going to, cause interest rates to go up dramatically or to go down because of the fact that they're monitoring that. All right, number 11. What were the powers of the new Federal Trade Commission, or sometimes known as the FTC? This was established in 1914, and the true power here is that it's going to allow the government to go in and investigate companies to see if they're, participating in unfair trade practices. One of the things that it can do is it can issue what they call a cease and desist order, and this is kind of a legal term. Basically, a cease and desist order orders a company to stop doing some type of activity. So if they're selling a product that could hurt or injure consumers, the government can issue the cease and desist order, and it would require the company to stop production of that item, and in some cases go back to the retail outlets and to pull those products from the shelves. Okay, we still have this today, by the way. So this is kind of a good thing. It may have, in a roundabout way, kind of controlled unfair competition, kind of limits that to a certain degree. What did this, nevertheless, we're going to move on to number 12. What did the Clayton Antitrust Act ban? And this was also passed in 1914 by our Congress. And for the most part, it was an agreement that required retailers who bought from certain companies to stop selling a competitor's product. So in other words, this idea that if a retailer had an agreement to buy from one company, and if they were selling the competitor's product, they couldn't sell both. Okay, they had to stop that. It also outlawed certain practices that restricted competition in the marketplace. It banned something called price discrimination. And what price discrimination is basically charging different prices to different consumers. So one consumer gets one price, a different consumer gets a different price. The idea is that it's going to correct some of the problems that we had originally with the Sherman Antitrust Act that we were struggling enforcing for many, many years. All right, other things that were going on. We're going to talk a little bit about the Keaton-Owing Child Labor Act of 1916. At some point in time, the Supreme Court's going to take a look at this, but this act, for the most part, was going to prohibit the employment of children under the age of 14 in factories that were producing goods for interstate commerce. The problem with that is that since child labor was not interstate commerce, meaning that kids are just manufacturing it, the federal government couldn't regulate it. Only states could regulate it, according to the U.S. Supreme Court. And that decision didn't get passed down until 1918. As a result of that, eventually our progressives are going to go back to the drawing board and find other ways to limit child labor. And one thing that does come about in this era of time, kind of leading into World War I, the Adamson Act was actually passed, and it established an 8-hour workday for our railroad workers. This is going to become the model, and eventually we're going to start seeing other businesses, other industries adopting the 8-hour workday. Another thing that was also passed was the Federal Farm Loan Act. This was to help provide farmers with loans at low interest rates to help them in farming practices. Number 14, how did public opinion about the role of government shift during the Progressive Era? And a lot of people started thinking that the federal government is going to play a more active role in regulating the economy, and it really does in this day and age too. A lot of people also started seeing that the federal government was involved in solving social problems, and before this period of time, the federal government really did very little to look at things like labor or the welfare of people. In number 15, what did W.E.B. Du Bois and others believe was essential to bring about an end to lynching and racial discrimination? And if you remember a while back, we talked about Du Bois, but it all goes back to this idea of voting rights. And as a result of this, Du Bois and some of his supporters form what is known as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or sometimes known as the NAACP. And their goal has been for years to fight for voting rights for African Americans, and they're still doing that to this day. Another group that was also kind of coming around about this period of time was the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League. And it was started by a guy named Sigmund Livingston, who happened to be a lawyer. He was also Jewish. And what he wanted to do is to have an organization that would combat discrimination and stereotypes that are kind of levied at the Jewish people. And he worked to remove a lot of the negative stereotypes of Jews in movies, in print, and on the stage. Thank you very much.